Hello, all you textual deviants, and welcome to another episode of Texting. I'm Mark Will in Taipei.
Y yo soy Álvaro de Campos in St. Petersburg.
And I
And we're
am.
joined today by our special guest, Steve, host of the Idiots Jing YouTube channel. Welcome.
Thank you, gentlemen. As a fan and also as somebody who is always trying to get you to, cover my deviant texts, you did Synecdoche, New York for me. Thank you very much.
Ah, that's right.
I'm really, really thrilled to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you, and we have chosen another one of your deviant texts, and that is Fernando Pessoa's Livro de Desassossego, which translates into English as the Book of Disquiet. And I think our text will be the Richard Zenith translation. I think that's what we all.
Yeah.
We all.
I mean, there's that Margaret. What is it, Margaret Joel Costa? Which I don't know. I've always found the Zenith to be
The Zenith.
the Zenith. You know.
Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. Is it Zenith? Is it Zenith? I don't know. I mean, he's American. How does one pronounce that their name?
I would say Zenith. Tomek.
I defer to Mark on all things scholarly.
We'll go with Zenith.
Good man. Well, before we start, why don't we talk briefly about our relation to the text? I read the Zenith translation in its entirety, I guess 15 years ago. That was my first and, before now, only exposure to the text. And it inspired me to read more of Pessoa's work, and it led me to eventually translate the only work that he published in his lifetime, and that is his epic poem, or it's really more of an epyllion, an epic in miniature, message, mensagem. And I translated it because it's pretty short. So I began translating from Portuguese into English just for my own amusement, and then I realized, hey, I could actually finish this thing, and I did, and I published it. It is available on Amazon. It's probably my bestseller. And a few years after it was published, I was contacted by Café a Brasileira in Lisbon, and they said they were publishing a deluxe edition of translations of message into other languages, and they picked my translation as the English translation. So it is available. Cool. If you go to Lisbon, you can find my translation of Pessoa's message in hardcover. And according to the manager of the cafe, it sells about 200 copies a month. And wow. I get nothing of that. I licensed my translation for a flat fee of 100 euros, and I stupidly didn't ask for royalties, but that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
But how cool is that, to have your work or to have your voice sort of intermingled with his in a way? I mean, what's it like translating? Because I don't speak Portuguese, so I'm just wondering how he comes across in Portuguese.
Well, I mean, I don't speak Portuguese either. I translated based on my knowledge of Spanish and Latin, and I just got myself well, I mean, I consulted other translations too, to be fair, but basically it was my knowledge of Spanish and Latin and a Portuguese verb chart. And so with those tools, I just made my way through the text and eventually hammered out a version of message in English. which
Well, that's fantastic. And the fact that it was chosen, because there have been other versions, right? The fact that it was chosen as a favorite by Portuguese speakers means that somehow your voice and their sense of what his voice is felt right to them. I mean, that you somehow captured the sensibility.
uh, could be. I mean, my method was very literal. I tried to translate as literally as possible, um, except when, being too literal made no sense in English. That was basically my standard. It was the Walter Benjamin method of translation, which always aims to be as literal as possible. But yeah, I mean, it resonated with them and continues to resonate with readers worldwide. If sales are any indicator, so I'm pleased with that. I mean, it's certainly nice to know that a hardcover deluxe version is available to patrons of that cafe in Lisbon, which actually has a statue or sculpture of Pessoa out front. We'll see a picture of that later. But anyway, I've talked enough. Why don't you tell us about your experience with the text, Steve? I think this is a much more important book to you than it is to me, even though it's important to me as well. But I think it has a deep personal meaning for you. Or am I wrong?
No, oh yeah. I mean, I would say, of it's sort of one of my desert island books. If I had to take, whatever, 5-10 books to the desert island, this would definitely be one of them, even though, unlike you, I have not read it through from from cover to cover. For
Mm.
me, it's almost like the Bible in a way. I mean, it is a sort of a Bible for me, actually. It's a sort of a touchstone, in terms of a kind of sensibility. I've been listening to the audiobook over the last sort of, just reacquainting myself with it over the last sort of 48 hours. And one thing that always strikes me when I come back to it, in a way that is incredible but also slightly disturbing, is that I often feel, whilst I'm listening, particularly the audiobook, that I'm just listening to the sound of my own thoughts.
Mm.
I mean, that's how personal it feels. It's like this guy it's like he's transcribing all the shit that goes on in my head, because I think we share a similar kind of, frame of mind, for want of a better word. But the way I discovered it was, I had the usual sort of bullshit car crash of a sort of relationship with this performance artist. Very interesting person. Look her up. Her name's Daniela Valls-Jen. She comes from Peru, and I think she's also a kind of an Enneagram 4 character. And she had a copy of this book on her shelf, and I kind of picked it up and just kind of fell in love with the voice, fell in love with the tone. So it was really through Daniela that I got given Fernando. And then, yeah, it's just one of those books that I keep on coming back to, particularly, I think, in certain moments of my life. It feels particularly kind of resonant and relevant.
And how long ago was that? I mean, when you
That
first
was
encountered
about
it?
10, 12 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
You say as you're reading, you feel like you're reading your own thoughts, but I think you've also noted that there's a similarity in tone to the musings of a certain Morrissey.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the qualities that I really love, and also sort of get a little bit too much after a while, which is, why I think it's sometimes, it's not always easy to just sit down and read the book from cover to cover. Um, also because of it being this somewhat deviant text, right? It's being this. I mean, it's all killer, no filler, is what I would say of the Book of Disquiet. That's my sense of it, because it's really it's like those moments. I mean, you know this as a writer. You can write something, and maybe 2,000 word, 3,000 word, whatever that is, and there'll be 3 or 4 searing paragraphs in that piece. And in a way, I think the Book of Disquiet are those 3 or 4 searing paragraphs, but hundreds of them, because it was essentially that sort of essential writing that he just accumulated over time, and I'm sure we'll go into where these sort of fragments were kept, because they were just a bunch of fragments. I mean, it wasn't something he sat down and essentially wrote as a cohesive and coherent text at all.
Right. Yeah. At his death, there was I learned this on my pilgrimage to Lisbon and to the Casa Fernando Pessoa. I visited the museum and learned about about his life and his writing habits and the history of the publication and so on. But basically, there was a big chest that had all of these fragments in it, and I guess editors like
You saw? Is that
Zenith.
the original chess? Because I've never been to that. I've never been to Lisbon. I've never been to that museum.
I think they do have the actual chest there. I'll have to look back at my pictures from that trip, but
What kind of size is it, out of interest? This particular chest where he just stuffed all of these pieces of himself into.
I mean, I'm not good with measurements, but it's like the kind of chest that I would see at my grandmother's house, where she would keep like old comforters and blankets and that kind of thing. So you could, if it's scraps of paper, you could maybe accumulate 1,000 pieces in there or more.
Yeah. I mean, I see him as also a very, very. I mean, he's a modern as in modernist. He's a postmodern figure, but I also see him as a very now figure, right? Or the sort of auto-fictitious, playing with, just sort of playing all of those games that the auto-fiction folk play. But in a way, that chest is also. It's a Google Drive. I mean, I'm sure I don't know what you write on, but I feel my Google Drive is that thing. It's just like full of thousands of documents, little fragments of pieces of writing, bits of this, bits of that, and very often when I'm also listening to him now, because I spend so much time on YouTube watching people, I also feel like it's kind of like it's almost like a sort of bare it all YouTube vlog. I think if he was around now, he would just have probably some sort of idiotic YouTube channel like my own, where he goes and bears his heart and soul to 200 subscribers.
I wonder, though. I mean, it's possible that if he were alive in this day and age, he would be even more anonymous than he was then. Like, he wouldn't. I imagine him not wanting to show his face, not wanting anyone to know anything about him. Maybe like working, if that were the medium he chose, podcasting, he would like write scripts and then never record them and never share them.
Actually, you're absolutely right. I'm just projecting onto him. You're absolutely right. Yes, he wasn't really an attention seeker. He was very withdrawn and insular. I think he lived a very, very introverted, withdrawn, insular sort of nobody life, right?
Was there like a fantasy in there for his work to be shared ultimately, do you think? Or do you think what do you think was the goal? I know he obviously didn't want to necessarily be a literary celebrity in his lifetime, but do you think he had some kind of like post-death?
Well, we'll get into that
Yeah, yeah.
soon. But as I say, the only book he published in his lifetime is this one. This is the only one. Um, and he also
But he had lots of aspirations, didn't he? And I think that's where he is sort of the quintessential writer, and often he's sort of he's often a little bit like the writer's writer because of the passages you selected, right? A lot of them are about writing, and he really gets to the heart of what that's about. It's a sort of
absolutely
salvation, but it's also a, a sort of sublime frustration. And yeah, like a lot of writers, I guess he was sitting around waiting for someone to see his genius and, some sort of Max Brod figure. Because I think there's also interesting comparisons to be made between him and Kafka, who was a
definitely
contemporary, right?
yes.
But he never really had that Max Brod figure in his life to champion him.
Yeah, that's true. I have one other note about that, but I'm going to save that for another slide. Just before we move on, though, Tomek, this was your first experience with the text, right? So you've got a completely different perspective. You want to talk about your encounter with the Book of Disquiet?
Well, I feel like it's fairly limited, as you already noted. You kind of gave me a homework of reading around 10 excerpts. And yeah, I think it's interesting how there are all these kind of standalone fragments. I'd like to read more to kind of get a greater feel for not only his different heteronyms, but also just to try to visualize this person better. So I admire this approach. I like what Steve has said so far about like these searing paragraphs and things that you would just come and have an encounter with one or two, like something like the Tao Te Ching. You might just consult it and get a kind of moment, but maybe it doesn't. But at the same time, you guys have kind of both emphasized like it's more melancholy aspects. So
Yeah, I mean,
about
I
like a
like him.
Bible
I
or
like
something.
for that reason. I sort of like which is also why I like listening to him. If I'm feeling particularly down in the dumps, and I don't want some cheery YouTube idiot to be telling me about don't worry, be happy. I really love. That's when I will switch on Pessoa, and because it's like having. That a kind of a similar sensibility friend who's going, yeah, life's a bitch and then you die. Yeah.
Nice Nas
Misery
quote as
loves
well.
company.
Yeah.
Can you describe, I mean, either of you, but I'm also pointing my question towards Steve, just because I think, first of all, you did some YouTube work around Pessoa, didn't you? And
That's
I'm
right.
sorry.
Before the idiocy Ching. I mean, maybe that could be put in. That'd be maybe fun to put in the show notes. I actually started a podcast and a sort of a Pessoa channel, and the idea behind it was really for me to kind of write to him. This sort of I suppose it was sort of a loneliness project as much as anything else. Like, okay, well, no one wants to hear my bullshit. So, but you do, and I want to hear your bullshit. So let's write to each other. It sort of was something along those lines, but yeah, it's it kind of got me into a corner which didn't really allow for any, and it's the Morrissey corner in a way. I mean, Morrissey has painted himself or I don't know, pushed himself, I think, very strongly into that corner, and it just becomes boring after a while. It just becomes kind of one note, and I think sometimes too much Pessoa can be can be that too. He's like a very, very dark chocolate or a very bitter coffee. Great single shot of espresso at times, but I don't know, to have him hundreds of pages on end. Also
Mhm.
because right, because of the intensity and the searing poetic quality of the writing, it can sometimes be a bit too much.
Well, that reminds me of a funny story when I, when I was reading this text 15 years ago and was so excited about it. I was sending daily excerpts to my email chat friends in the States. And, when they first started receiving them, they were like, wow, that's amazing. And then after maybe 10 or 20 of them, they started getting sarcastic and saying, oh, another edition of Deep Thoughts by Fernando Pessoa.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and so I said, okay, I get it. It's too much.
And obviously, I noticed so many contradictions even within the 10 or so passages that you highlighted. In
Mm-hmm.
terms of these kind of more grandiose statements that he makes, only to then have a completely different tone. And I know that's self-aware, but it also, I don't know, it seems to make my like reverence for him a little bit less in some way. I mean, I'm not arguing that you should have to have some kind of stable philosophy and everything should be like tenets of that. But when on one hand you're like rallying against poetry or something, and then you're talking about how you published this poem, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I
Oh
don't know. It
yeah,
just
and he's written a lot of poetry. Although his poetry, I think, I mean, that's, I think, also the one of the issues with him, which maybe we can get onto. This whole idea around the heteronyms. I think a lot of the heteronyms. And I get this, particularly as an Enneagram 4, and I think he was as well. I think a lot of the heteronyms was kind of like a distancing thing, that he would start to feel kind of ashamed and alienated by a certain voice that he was putting out. And then he would kind of, and I do this too, and then he would sort of switch voices or say that he's switching voices
Yeah.
in order to kind of distance himself from that other voice. And yet when you look at them all together, it's always just him. The heteronyms I don't think they really bear up to sort of distinct, in very different kind of literary personas. I mean, I know they do in his imagination, but at the end of the day, I think it's always just Fernando Pessoa,
Mm-hmm.
writing Fernando Pessoa, basically.
Well, he admits as much in one of the fragments we're going to look at today. So maybe we should move on to that.
Yeah.
So I selected the preface because, well, it's the preface. Before we get into the actual text, we should probably deal with this. The preface
Yeah.
is actually written by the orthonym Fernando Pessoa, the man himself, right? But the actual book of Disquiet is written by one of the heteronyms, so that's an important distinction. I mean, when it's published in today's format, it says Fernando Pessoa, but according to Pessoa himself, he wasn't the author. He just wrote the preface. So
Yeah.
that's an interesting distinction to make. And in this preface, he's saying he describes his meeting with the author of the Book of Disquiet, a certain Fernando Suarez. So he says that Lisbon has a certain number of eating establishments in which, on top of a respectable looking tavern, there's a regular dining room with the solid and homey air of a restaurant in a small trainless town. And I've got here a picture of Cafe a Brasileira. There's the statue of Pessoa outside. Again, this is where my translation is available, so I couldn't resist doing a bit of self-promotion there. And this is where he meets Mr. Bernardo Soares, who is one of Pessoa's
Yeah.
heteronyms. So it's like he's meeting himself in another form.
100%.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and he references this periodical Orfeu, Orpheus, which he and his literary associates published their work in. But interestingly, he says in this preface, the art of those who write in Orfeu speaks only to a few. So he understands that this is not for everyone. He's cultivating an esoteric audience, maybe no audience at all. So
Yeah.
I guess that
Again,
relates to our question
this
of
is very much in line, right, with what I would call the Enneagram 4, Enneagram 5, either 4-wing 5 or 5-wing 4 personality type. Because these types, these idiots, and of course, when I say these idiots, I'm referring to me and maybe even you two to some extent, right? These idiots are undoubtedly kind of elitists. They get off on being quite elitist, right? Anyone who has a podcast called the Textual Deviancy that looks at these kind of obscure texts and films, and I'm thinking also of Tomek's last project, which he did. This sort of mishmash of kind of music and kind of reportage, travelogue, collage. Again, I'm thinking of Daniela Valsgen, who was this performance artist, again, big fan of Pessoa. These are all people who enjoy not being part of the crowd, right? Standing to one side. And yet at the same time, of course, moaning and bitching about that, and feeling intensely alienated. And yet, of course, it's that very alienation which is also enjoyed and sort of creates the kernel, if you like, for our, because I would put ourselves maybe into that bracket,
sure.
our imaginative work.
That's an excellent point. Tomek?
Yeah, Tomek, you're an elitist.
You can comment. Come on.
I don't know.
Tell us about your elitism.
Yeah, I don't feel like I'm elitist. But
No, elitist
I'm not
has a
offended
sense of
by
looking
that.
down, and it's not a looking down. It's more a sense of, again, it's more the sense of, my voice is not, it's not cut from the same cloth as whatever the standard cultural fare is.
Sure,
It's the
I don't want to
indie
sound. I don't
spirit.
know.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's the indie spirit. Yeah.
I don't necessarily characterize myself that way, but I appreciate other people doing that. I mean, I think I definitely used to kind of get off on that identity more, and that's not meant to sound condescending or used to. That sounds horrible. Like I used to, but maybe I'm just in a space where I feel one with all things. So
You feel one with all things, and yet you produce work that is distinctly avant-garde. I mean, maybe not consciously avant-garde, but you're not playing the game of I don't know, whatever that game is, right? Of trying to create work that will be the most palatable to the most people. I mean,
Yeah,
that's my
sure.
sense
you're
of
not
your work, and
appealing.
probably Mark's work as well.
Yeah, you're not appealing, or we are not appealing to the mainstream. We have no desire to do that. Like the purpose. I don't know. I can't speak for anyone else, but I'm doing it for me. Lawrence said, you know, it's not art for art's sake. It's art for my sake, and
Mm.
that maybe Pessoa would have had a similar credo.
100%. I really do think that, and we see this in his life, and we see this in his writings, right? I mean, it's like he basically says again and again and again that without this project, whatever the project is, he's lost. He's a goner. He really is. I mean, he really is. He has to. He goes under without that.
Mm.
And I think anyone who uses creative work in that foundational way knows what he means by that, right?
Absolutely. All right. Sorry to keep moving here, but I
Well, I
mean,
want to say, I
we
want to
could
say
spend an
something else.
hour
Yeah.
on we could spend an hour on each slide, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, just that when I create something, I do feel like, first of all, I don't think I'm on the same level as either of you in terms of creativity these days. At points in my life, yes, but right now, I'm not as I'm a teacher, and and I'm a administrator in a way. So, and I create a lot of lessons, but it's a very different type of vibe. But I would just say that, yeah, like I think that the stuff that I create is meant to be very aesthetically tantalizing. Like that's my aim, is like to create a sort of
Mm, mm.
something that's beautiful. Um and I don't know, in some of the things that Pessoa says, like it's like that, maybe it's just like that modesty or humility, but he'll just say those statements like, well, maybe everything I'm writing has no value or no, but it's just, as you said, is it just about his addiction to kind of writing, or where does beauty come into the mix, or to the point where he's like, he thinks he's consciously trying to create something beautiful? Like, I wonder where that ties in to his
Well, there are
production process.
some, at least one or two of the fragments that we're going to consider touch upon that, but maybe it's just his consciousness that it's the project is always doomed to failure, no matter how well one writes. In his case, right? But it could be no matter how well one paints or composes music or does any creative activity. There's always a sense of failure. One can never adequately express oneself or realize one's ideal vision, you know?
Yes and
I,
no, because, like, again, I that's his tone, and I recognize that's the tone that many people feel, but that kind of
Don't you feel
perfectionism.
that with your own work, Tomek? I mean, that sense of, that sense where when you're creating something, right? You're really, really completely and utterly encapsulated in that process, and you're kind of free. Again, one of the passages he talks about sort of the freedom of being completely and utterly enmeshed in that creative process. But then as soon as it's there and you sort of look around and see it, but see it not from, let's call it, a subjective place, but more from your editorial objective mind, you then start to see immediately all the idiocies of it, essentially. And you start to see that, like everything else, to put it in my language, it was basically created by an idiot. And you can see all the idiotic motivations and layers to the thing, which in the process of creation, you were not clearly not self-conscious about at all, right? It's this problem with consciousness and self-consciousness.
I
Yeah,
think
I just
that's a
don't think I
very
have the
important
same
point.
instinct, though. I don't have the same instinct. Like, I'm very much into the celebrate yourself instinct that, the Beats were really trying to champion, that, a Ginsberg might champion. Mark, in the podcasting world, yes, I do feel like that kind of, my immediate reaction afterwards is like more towards like shame or regret. But a lot of times it genuinely is just, I love that piece of beauty. I love those words put together, and I don't go into that
Yeah.
kind of more
And that's
cynical
what
or
I
critical.
I mean, that's what I'm aiming, that's what I'm working towards. Because ultimately, as we can see from this slide, right, we're all nobodies. And so let's not get too precious about our output, about our content creation, right? Because it's all the shame and all the distancing and all of that stuff. It's all just in our heads. So
Mm.
definitely working towards that. But yeah, it's
Well,
interesting. Pretty tricky
I
to, yeah.
yeah, I think that's a very important point, and I would just add that there's a third level too, right? There's the initial stage of creation, then there's the self-critical phase when we look back at whatever it was we created. And then there's a third level when we actually come to share that with a wider audience. And this is what leads to all kinds of procrastination on my part, whether it's a Substack post or the publication of the sequel to the novelette that I've been working on with my co-author GJ Villa, or the publication of my novel Goat Songs. I mean, that to me, that is the most difficult hurdle, I guess. Just the to get to the point where, okay, this is as perfect as I can make it. I'm ready to share it with the world, even though I'm conscious of some of the flaws, which maybe no one else will even notice, but I know they're there. And I mean, this is the agony of creation and production for me. Just the inadequacy of it, the idiocy of it, as you say. So, it's one thing for me to be self-critical about my work, but then when I take the next step of sharing it with a larger audience, it's even more traumatic, And
Yeah,
and
that,
Pessoa, in a way,
that's
Pessoa never
really,
got over that. Pessoa never got over that, right? Like everything just remained in the chest until,
yeah.
I mean, apart from Orfeu and this, and I think he wrote a travelogue in English about Lisbon, so, or
Yeah,
like a
because I think
tourist
that
guide.
adds an extra layer of exposure and potential alienation, right? Because already there is that kind of that alienation between the subject and the object being, both being the same person in this case, right? The object who has the text that has been written, or ourselves that are revealed in the text. So already there's a kind of an alienation there. And then, but that's just a sort of a binary thing. That's a sort of a to and fro. But then as soon as you bring in another person, even if that person is not necessarily visible, um, yeah, something very strange happens. It sort of increases some form of exposure, alienation, some form of shame. There's a lot going on there, which I think a lot of writers, understandably, a lot of people who create have something of that. But I think it's also a certain personality type who maybe gets jarred by that.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know what my personality type would be, but I certainly feel it. So, all right. So, as we said, the actual author of the Book of Disquiet is Pessoa's heteronym Bernardo Soares, who is an assistant bookkeeper in the city of Lisbon. And as we pointed out, Lisbon in the work of Pessoa has the same relation that, Prague does to the work of Kafka. So, or Dublin does to Joyce, Um, so so Lisbon is almost a character in the book as much as this Bernardo Soares is, this heteronym of Pessoa himself, and he's a nobody, right? He's an office clerk, an assistant bookkeeper, just like Kafka was a, a bureaucrat at a or a clerk at a insurance company or whatever it was he did, and it was Kafka who said, an
As was
office.
Pessoa. Pessoa and Kafka had very similar jobs. They both
Yeah,
fulfilled. They were both sort of these. I mean, Pessoa exactly worked as a kind of a clerk. A bit of sort of, he was translating mainly business correspondence for this wholesale exporter of wines and various other places. But again, yeah, both of them had these kind of 9-to-5 desk jobs, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it was Flaubert who said, "Be normal and I don't know, average in your everyday life, so that you can be amazing in your creative work." Right? Like you have your routine, and you do whatever you need to do to pay the bills, and then that enables you to have this rich life of the imagination, or this life of creativity. So Pessoa, Kafka very much seem to
Yeah,
follow that
and, and
pattern.
and while that slide is there, the nobody slide, right? I guess also that gets to the heart of his, and his whole sensibility, which is that that everything that is meaningful and personal, if you like, to him and about his life, it all happens in his imagination. He sort of says, "I am just the other creature. Let's call it the creature who called Fernando Pessoa. Is just a cipher, but it's only his thoughts and his creations that really hold some meaningful essence. Everything else is just a sort of a hollow husk." I mean, he
Yes,
states that quite explicitly, I think, in one of the fragments we're going to look at.
yes, absolutely. Well, I don't want to spend too much time on Bernardo Suarez, but I thought it was interesting the physical descriptions that Pessoa in the preface gives of him. So Suarez is fairly tall and thin. He must have been about 30 years old. He dressed with a carelessness that wasn't entirely careless. That's a very Pessoan phrase there. His pale, uninteresting face seemed to suggest hardships, anxieties, and the suffering born of the indifference that comes from having already suffered a lot, also very Pessoan. A certain air of intelligence animated his features in a certain uncertain way. that that kind of phrasing is so hilarious. It's like, um, who else uses that kind of phrasing? It's pretty
What do you call
unique.
it? That's just some kind of like paradoxical language. I mean, what?
It's paradoxical, yeah. I mean, it's a Pessoan tick, I guess, a verbal tick. But
Interesting. Yeah,
he's
you're
got
right.
all
Yeah.
kinds of phrases like this. A carelessness that wasn't entirely careless, a certain uncertain way. It's just
Yeah.
what's he's teasing us. He's joking with
He's
us.
teasing,
He's
but I think, again, coming back to this sort of four sensibility, because I do see this as very much the sensibility of the Enneagram 4. He's kind of wanting to have his cake and eat it. Because I do see this, I think fours struggle. There's a lot of identity slippage, and they struggle to say, "I am this." Again, there's this sort of sense of, well, yeah, I'm this, but I'm also very, very much that.
mm-hmm.
And there's this kind of, I think, a very, very strong polarity there at all times, in the sense that he's sort of saying, I'm very much this, but I'm also very much that at the same time.
When you say though, like he wants to have his cake and eat it too, there's like somewhat of like a critical charge to that, right? But is it maybe perhaps more so that it's actually he's right in thinking that he is all things? That's a very Whitman point of view as well, right? Like, do
Yes,
I contradict
yes,
myself?
very
Very
well. I
well, then I
contradict
contain
myself.
multitudes, right?
Yes,
So,
Yes, but Whitman, I feel, says that in a celebratory way,
right,
whereas Pessoa does not come across. I feel it's more tortured.
mm.
It's more like, I'm this and I'm that,
sure.
and that can't be squared because I am literally the two polarities
That's an important
smooshed into
distinction.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Agree, and I like that distinction that you're pointing out. I'm just saying, I still want to ask you about that cake and eat it too idea, because if you're trying to really go for accuracy, then I think it is very interesting to argue we have these multiple selves, and I want to acknowledge it, and to limit myself to one is just less true. So I want to be as
Well,
true as possible. And
yeah, well, I mean, as we're talking about this, I'm just wondering, like, is the Whitman-esque view the healthier one? Like, if
right,
Pessoa had been able to embrace this Whitman-esque celebratory attitude towards the containment of multitudes, would he have been more productive, happier? Like, would he have had a better life with many friends and lovers? I mean, is it just a personality quirk? He just wasn't cut out to be that way. He was just not capable of that. There was no way to convince him to embrace that. Something
Yeah,
to
I
think
would say
about.
so. I mean, it's interesting also to think about Pessoa's sexuality because I mean, either I think he was asexual or he was closeted gay. There are where he's really starts to get kind of very effusive and talk about. I'm thinking about this particular passage of this, someone he was working with who leaves and he's going to miss them, and I mean, he only seems to be able to do that about men. He does. He never really. He never. That's he never. You never really hear him yearning for female company. So it's a very interesting thing. I mean, I think you're right. I think if he had a different personality style, he would have had a different, more Whitman-esque, potentially more Whitman-esque kind of life.
On that point, he did write a poem on Antinous, the male lover, obviously, of the Emperor Hadrian. Like, it's a long lyrical
Interesting.
poem celebrating, youthful masculinity. So
Yeah.
there is some evidence, and I think the Alvaro de Campos heteronym is like an acknowledged bisexual. So there's reason to think that maybe he was closeted.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right, so yeah, here's another Pessoan turn of phrase. His voice, this is Suarez again. His voice was hesitant and colorless, as in those who hope for nothing because it's perfectly useless to hope. I don't know if we need to read all of these, but I think the main point is Pessoa is saying that he remained the friend of this Bernardo Suarez, devoted to the end for which he'd drawn me to himself, the publication of this book. So that's the important part. Pessoa himself is Bernardo Suarez Max Brod, right? He's the one who retrieves the manuscripts from the fire or whatever and shares them with the world. Although that didn't actually happen. He confined them to the trunk, but they were eventually rescued by someone else who was Pessoa to the actual Pessoa, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm.
All right, so enough on the preface. Let's get into the heart of the book, which is called A Factless Autobiography. And this is a series of 400 plus fragments, which, were never given any definitive order or shape. That's always the editor's or the translator's decision. Again, we have gone with the Zenith text. So we just have to keep in mind that it is to some degree arbitrary. Like, there's no reason to think fragment 1 should be read
Yeah.
first. You can
Which
just
makes it again a very, very, in this case, a kind of postmodern book, right? I'm thinking of someone like, again, this is a very deviant text. I haven't read it because it doesn't. I've never really got into it, but I'm thinking of that B.S. Johnson book, which I'm sure you've come across, right? Where you're just given all the chapters and you can put them in whatever order you like. Right, that kind of thing. And in a way, there is something. I'm surprised that somebody hasn't done a sort of maybe a kind of a website where you've got all the fragments and you can generate sort of random kind of random sequences of them, because I think that would make for a very interesting sort of project. But that's very available because each of the pieces are quite standalone, although they do have a similar sensibility that knits them all together.
Well, and this is why it is a kind of holy book that you can just open to any section. The Bible, or people used to do this with the Aeneid, right? It was like used for soothsaying. If you have some problem, just as now people consult the I Ching or, the tarot cards, there's a certain element of the random. You have an issue, just open to whatever page. Oh, I turned to fragment 336. It says, a zebra can't be grasped by a man who doesn't know more than a donkey. Okay, what does that mean to me at this particular moment?
Yeah,
I wanted to add
like that.
Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
No, go for it.
Well, just a quote from Zenith is just, he recommends that the reader invent their own order, or better yet, read the work's many parts in absolutely random order. And yeah, apparently he made some degree of editorial decisions in creating a kind of flow. Was it not possible to sequence them all chronologically? Do you know?
But
I don't know if
I don't know that they were all dated.
Yeah.
I mean, you got a
but I'm saying, could you use some kind of like advanced DNA or something now, some kind of treatment to say, because just that might be, even if that wasn't necessarily his intention, it might be a useful way of looking at it, because it's your age gets us all, right? And age affects us all. So reading it chronologically would give us the opportunity to see the growth of this human. And
kind of,
how
but
historical
I wonder
events
if
affected him.
that's what the text is about. Because again, coming back to this idea of it being sort of like a Google Drive, and I do one day hope that Gemini AI is going to be good enough that I can just sort of unleash it on my 20,000 fragments sitting in my Google Drive and just sort of say to it, piece together a little book of Disquiet for me, made up of the best bits. Because again, I think partly what the book does so splendidly is it does sort of cherry pick in a way, and there's something, I don't know if it would be as good if it was sequentially following his writing historically, as it were, right? Following through on the fragments. There's something about the way that it collages together everything that he's ever done.
Collage, yes.
Yeah.
But so you're saying
we've talked
that's a credit to Zenith then?
I think so.
Sorry,
I think Zenith
Okay.
Zenith is incredible in terms of, I mean, wow, the amount of, I mean, his whole life has really just been given over to Fernando Pessoa, essentially, right? In translating, and then and of course, recently he wrote this massive biography of him as well, and he's translated all the poetry. I mean, I do take my hat off to people like that who literally just give their whole life over to the championing of one individual. I mean, in that way, he is Pessoa's Brod.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I was just going to say, in many episodes of texting, we've referred to the Burroughs cut-up method, so that certainly relates to this idea of collage and the random and, I don't know, postmodern sensibilities, the lack of sequential or chronological order.
But I'm feeling like some contradictions here, which I want you guys to confront. So like, on the one hand, you're saying like, Zenith is recommending to read it in a random order, so he's kind of like saying, look, actually, my way is not necessarily at all right. And so, why would reading it chronologically be in any way inferior than
It
the one that
wouldn't.
Zenith has made?
It wouldn't. I'm not saying don't do it. I mean, if you want to do that DNA testing and, you know, organize all those pages,
And
why
also, like,
not?
if there's the idea that they're standalone. So, but now we're kind
Yeah,
of
they
talking
are
about the
very
relationship
standalone. I
between
mean, I think
them.
each of those fragments, it's in some ways almost a bit like a song. And so, again, if you think of the whole, I don't know, Morrissey oeuvre, for example, right? Yeah, you don't necessarily need to go right back and start. I mean, you can, of course, if you're a fan, but you don't necessarily need to go right back and start with the first Smiths album and then all the way up to the crud that he's mainly producing today. You can, yeah, it's like a bit like being on Spotify. It's like, well, listen to the greatest hits, which I think by and large is what, again, the Book of Disquiet sort of is. It sort of is the greatest hits. I don't think it's everything that was in that chest. I don't know.
That's what I'm confused about, because some long review that I just read before the show was kind of criticizing how much fluff there is in it and saying it would be a much more effective read if it was scaled down. So it's like they were arguing the opposite, that they've just put everything in here. And I don't know, but whether how
Well, I
important that is
mean,
anyway.
everyone is free to have his or her own book of disquiet. Like, pick your own greatest hits and
Sure.
say that's the book of disquiet, and rearrange them. Do whatever you want.
But the
And you've
very
kind of
cool
done
thing I
that.
think about him, which maybe also, I don't know, sort of makes this tack not the most useful one, is that also I think wherever you step into the stream, as it were, you're always getting the same water. You're always kind of getting him. So in that sense, it doesn't really matter where you open the book, what sequence you open it, how you read it. Every line is shot through with his particular kind of DNA, if not every line, at least certainly every paragraph.
You're still
And
listening to
so,
Radiohead. Yeah.
yeah, so it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I think, yeah.
Just the one
We're
little. I know we're all
yeah.
like eager to talk right now, and I get it. It's like,
Well, I'm just saying we're
it's fun,
almost
No,
we're almost an hour in, and we
Yeah,
haven't
I
even.
know.
Potentially go and empty my bladder. I don't know.
Me too, actually. Me too.
Sure,
Can we
Can we?
pause?
absolutely.
Okay, cool.
And we're back after a brief restroom break, and we will begin our discussion now of the Factless Autobiography. These are the 400 plus fragments, the heart of the Book of Disquiet. Again, the author is Pessoa's heteronym, Bernardo Soares. And for our discussion, I chose 9 of these 400 plus fragments in a somewhat random fashion, but I do have reasons for choosing certain fragments, which I'll explain later. But the 9 is a tribute to the Enneagram, which is very important to Steve, and maybe he can briefly explain why and how it relates to Pessoa.
Well, I mean, Pessoa, as I've already sort of suggested, is, I think, an Enneagram 4, an Enneagram 5. And really, these are just archetypes. They're sort of archetypal egoic frameworks, I guess, that we were just talking in the break about the I Ching. That for some people just sees their imagination. I think maybe you have to be of a slightly, I would say, which I think I probably am, a sort of slightly autistic mindset, to enjoy the fact that you can kind of put people in kind of boxes in a way, based on their main egoic engines. But essentially the 4 is sometimes known as the romantic individualist, and the 5 is the investigator. And both of them, I think it's great that you've got the image there, because they are both at the bottom, and they often feel that way. 5s don't have, 4s are heart types, so they've got more of that sort of sentimental, aching, yearning, despairing thing going on. 5s are more cognitive, so 5s, 6s, and 7s are cognitive types. 2s, 3s, and 4s are heart types. But both of those types are both types, I would say, that are very, very connected to shadow, the shadow of others, and their own kind of shadow, and they sort of feel like they're always at the bottom of, I don't know, at the bottom of the bottom, whatever that is. I think Camus, I think, was a 5, wing 4. So another similar figure. And I always think of the myth of Sisyphus in relation to that. I think 4s and 5s are trying to push that, I don't know, life project up the hill to reach the 9. The 9s are these sort of perfectly balanced, free and easy, don't worry, be happy kind of folk, and but never getting there, because the stone is always sort of tumbling down back into the abyss.
Excellent.
The 9 has their own
Tomek.
struggles, right?
What's that?
The 9 has their own struggle, presumably.
The 9 have their own struggle. The 9 struggle is basically, in order to be so, chilled and cool with everything and everyone, you have to do a lot of repressing. You have to really keep down a lot of, whereas 4s don't really do that. But 4s do, and other types as well. They will self-medicate. So I think a lot of Pessoa's despair, existential despair, for want of a better word, was self-medicated through cigarettes and alcohol, and because he was he smoked ceaselessly, and drank all the time.
He was highly caffeinated too. He drank a lot of this strong Portuguese coffee, which is like espresso. It's called bica or pizza. I don't know the exact pronunciation. Portuguese is hard to speak and pronounce, but it's Bica. Anyway, let's get into these fragments. I sort of did follow the chronological framework, at least as it was laid down by Zenith. So, I figured his number 1 would be a good place to start. He obviously picked that for some reason. If it's the first one, it must have something to say to us. I've got a little fragment or a little excerpt that I'll read quickly, and it might guide our discussion. He says, I see life as a roadside inn, and that's pictured here, where I have to stay until the coach from the abyss pulls up. I don't know where it will take me because I don't know anything. I could see this inn as a prison, for I'm compelled to wait in it. I could see it as a social center, for it's here that I meet others. But I'm neither impatient nor common. I leave who will to stay shut up in their rooms, sprawled out on beds where they sleeplessly wait. And I leave who will to chat in the parlors, from where their songs and voices conveniently drift out here to me. I'm sitting at the door, feasting my eyes and ears on the colors and sounds of the landscape, and I softly sing, for myself alone, wispy songs I compose while waiting. And later, the quote that's featured in the slide here, which I think is very important, very indicative of the content of the entire text. If what I write in the book of travelers can, let me enlarge this, when read by others at some future date, also entertain them on their journey, then fine. If they don't read it or are not interested, that's fine too. Any comments?
I don't know. I mean, I feel that's a somewhat feigned insouciance. You know, in the sense that I don't get the feeling when I'm reading Pessoa that he is that he is simply writing these sentences for himself, because they are so crafted. And if you are crafting something, very often you are crafting them with some external eye or ear in mind, even if not at a fully conscious level.
Well, sure. It's a pose. I mean, it's the indifferent author. He's playing the role of the indifferent creator, but it is a role.
Yeah.
So I just don't know. Isn't it enough though just to craft for yourself, for your own satisfaction?
Sure, that's what we said. That's the Lawrencian motto, right? Art for my
Yeah, so I
sake.
just want to. I'm just throwing that at Steve. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in a way, I think we're all now in the current zeitgeist thrown into doing that more than ever before, just simply because there just ain't enough eyeballs or ears around to, you know, everyone's it feels like everyone's now like a content creator, and ultimately though, yeah, there just aren't enough eyes and ears to actually read the work that is being created, because there's just too much of it. So it has to be driven. It has to be driven now, I think, by that that impetus, because I don't think anybody can expect really to be read or listened to, maybe in the way that they might have hoped to be read or listened to, I don't know, even 20, 30 years ago.
What is behind the motivation to have massive eyeballs? I know I'm pushing you on this, Steve, and I love you, so don't.
Massive eyeballs?
Yeah,
What do you mean by massive eyeballs?
The massive number of eyeballs?
Oh, what is the motivation to have massive eye? Oh, to have more than 200 and what have I got at the moment? 217, I think. I was at 212 for for 2 weeks. I was thinking, oh shit, I'm never going to get beyond 212. And now I've got like I've got 12 more eyeballs, which is somehow meaningful. What is the motivation? Well, I mean, that's a really good question. I think it's just because we are social creatures, and no man is an island, and ultimately our value is at some level, whether we like it or not, kind of constructed or created in the eye or in the ear of the other. You can have all sorts of ideas about yourself, but if that's not being verified by another person going, oh, okay, I'll watch your 12-minute rant about whatever.
So it's a kind of validation. Yeah.
I think
fundamentally,
yeah.
But it's also a question of energy. I mean, there's no question that reaction or non-reaction from an audience can influence a creator, just think of a live music performer, right? Like if everyone's sitting on their asses or looking at their phones while you're up there singing a song, that's not the same vibe as it is if everyone is standing up, pumping their fists, singing along, and screaming. Like it's just a completely different
That's a really good point,
energy.
actually. Yeah, and I think that comes across in the creative act as well, right? So I get a kick out of thinking, like, even if I don't know who's going to be watching this, but I know one or two people. I know one or two friends who do watch some of the crap that I put out there. And so there is a pleasure, there is a real pleasure in sort of thinking, Rob's gonna enjoy this bit, or so and so's, again. So there's something also that's quite I don't know, I don't really have the words for it, right? It's social, but small scale social as well, I think, right? I mean, I don't necessarily really care that much about the people who are completely anonymous to me, but there is sort of just like if you've got a juicy tidbit, Tomek, that's come up in your life, and you're thinking, oh, I'm looking forward to telling your partner about it or something like that. I think there's some of that pleasure there too. It sort of sharpens the fun of the creation in so that I don't think I write as well or express myself as well if I am doing it in a purely insular, non-transmitting way.
Yeah, fair, fair.
Garcia Marquez allegedly said, "I write so that my friends will love me."
Yeah, and yeah, I mean that to me sounds very Enneagram 4. Yeah, it's trying to find a reason for others to give us perhaps what is the most valuable resource on this planet, which is someone else's attention, right?
Mm.
I mean, I often say that people pay me, and they pay you as well at some level, right? That people pay us to give them attention. Your teachers, right? You're being paid to give someone. Well, you're being paid to convey information as well, but you're also being paid when you're marking someone's essay or script or something. You're being paid to give them your valuable attention. And if you weren't paid, you wouldn't be looking at that essay.
Mm.
Sure.
Yeah, good point. All right, our next fragment is number 12. We've got an image here of crocheting because the act of writing and composition in this fragment is likened to that ritualistic activity of crocheting. I thought that was a unique image. It reminds us of the Greek concept of the rhapsode, the stitcher of songs. So
Mm.
um, this is a very uh, I don't know, often cited passage. It says, "In these random impressions, and with no desire to be other than random, I indifferently narrate my factless autobiography, my lifeless history. These are my confessions, and if in them I say nothing, it's because I have nothing to say."
Yeah, that's such an interesting idea, isn't it? Because and that's where, in some way, the crochet analogy, even though it's his analogy, right, sort of falls apart because when you're crocheting, you're kind of following the line, and and it all. Whereas I get the sense, because I often think about this, like, how do these texts come into being? I mean, I think about this with lots of texts, right? And of course, it's not like crocheting; it's more like some sort of um, so what's that? It's kind of like what's it called? Like free association, essentially, because presumably these texts came into being with an impulse, a strong impulse to say something, and then you sit down and you know what it's like to write, right? And you start writing, but then one sentence leads to the next, and leads to the next, and leads to the next, and then you come back and then you scribble on in the margins and whatnot, and that doesn't feel like crocheting at all. Um, and in a way, that the nothing to say is also maybe an allusion. Well, that's how I read it, an allusion to the unconscious, because I think what we love about writing is it kind of gives us glimpses of our own unconscious processes, right? That consciously we might want to say something, but you start writing a sentence and suddenly you are saying something else. And that's because you have nothing to say, but your unconscious, oh my God, it has plenty to say. And if you can sort of channel that, boom, off you go, right? It's just limitless.
So here too, we see Pessoa as poseur. He claims not to care what anyone thinks, and he claims that he's just crocheting, but he's being disingenuous. There's a false modesty and a pretense of indifference, which is, not
Well, maybe
genuine,
he's not
maybe.
being a poser, because again, is he not also talking to the profound? I mean, you tell me, because I'm talking to two writers, right? There is something profoundly mysterious about sitting down and writing, or even speaking, just how just stuff comes up, and it's like, where does it come from? Where does it come from, in a way? And I feel like at some level he's really he's beholden to that mystery, and he's very aware of that mystery, the mystery of creation. Wouldn't you say?
Well, yes. I mean, I also thought that, the image of crocheting is just to emphasize. He chooses that merely to emphasize the routine of it, right? Like, just as an old grandmother would sit down and crochet after dinner as a habit, this is his habit.
Yeah.
Instead of doing needlework or whatever, he sits at his desk day, every day at the same time. That's his routine, and he just starts writing. So even though one
Exactly.
sentence leads to another in a different way, he's not following a fixed pattern. In a way, he is, because he's just doing his routine.
Well, I
And
think it would be remiss to ignore the previous passage. Sorry to talk over you,
you know,
but just in the previous passage, you've got the reference to weaving straw, which he rejects because he says it's too pessimistic. And then he says, actually, we're like the girl who embroiders pillows. And, that to me suggests an element of beauty as well, right? In relation
mhm.
to the straw. So,
But also very homespun, and also a kind of a pastime, because again, right, writing and creating is a pastime, and it's a very enriching one. And there are many pastimes in this world, and of course, us writers, we choose to give a lot of our time to that rather than this. Um, and again, why do we do it? Who knows? I mean, he sort of says, he also refers to it as an addiction. It's
Mm,
just sort of something he has to do.
yes,
Yeah, which
because
makes me
we're
also want to.
idiots.
Yeah, but sort of, but idiots in that sense, of course. I have it up here. We were talking about the tarot. I think the image of the fool, of course, is a good one to bring in, because I think there is
Thank you
something.
for doing that. That's my book cover.
Oh wow, wow, wow! Okay, oh amazing,
You're giving
yeah.
me so many opportunities to plug my shit.
Plug away. That's so cool. Yeah, because I think also I want to chuck in, as we're on threads. I want to chuck in, because I'm always quoting this. that William Stafford poem, because I think it's so relevant to this idea of the thread. There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you're pursuing. You have to explain about the thread, but it is hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen. People get hurt or die. You suffer and get old. Nothing you do can stop time unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread. And when I'm reading Pessoa, that's also where he inspires me to keep on creating, keep on doing my crocheting, right? He's basically saying again and again and again, don't ever let go of the thread, because if you let go of the thread, what are you, Steve? What am I, Fernando? Well, if Pessoa lets go of the thread, all he is just some pathetic, alcoholic nobody, wasting away his life and, dying of cirrhosis of the liver at an early age. Pretty pathetic life. But with that thread in his hands, something sublime, something transcendent, something that is the most magnificent, you could say, outpouring of the human spirit occurs, right? I really, really feel that that's core to him as well.
Well said.
Well said. Yes. All right. Sorry to move so quickly, but we're now looking at fragment 152. Those of you watching the video can see this slide of a puddle after high tide. I think this is such an interesting image as well. To write is to lose myself, yes, but everyone loses himself because everything gets lost. I, however, lose myself without any joy, not like the river flowing into the sea for which it was secretly born, but like the puddle left on the beach by the high tide, its stranded water never returning to the ocean, but merely sinking into the sand. How's that for a disquieting image?
Yeah, it makes me think of I watched a podcast recently with Gabor Mate, and yeah, he was defining addiction, as something that, yeah, basically that you're losing yourself in, but is destructive, right? So it's like it's interesting because I would see writing as like a profoundly positive addiction. So it's interesting that he would say without any joy.
Well, see, this is what I love. This is one of the things I love about Pessoa, the meta attitude towards writing. He's writing about writing, and the struggle of the attempt to write. He's documenting the failure of the writer when he says something like what we see in this section. Why do I write if I can't write any better? But what would become of me if I didn't write what I can, however inferior it may be to what I am? I mean, this is the essence of the struggle, right? We know Faulkner talks about this too, right? Like you're never going to succeed at what you're trying to do. You're never going to perfectly realize your vision. I mean, maybe one or both of you would disagree with that, but that's certainly my experience. Like, it's never good enough, but you can't stop trying. It's like the Beckettian notion of fail better.
Yes, absolutely. But that's also, I wonder if that's also because the vision, as it were, it makes me think of, the trigram heaven, which is these three yang lines, which I think a lot about in different ways. But I think that's often where writing starts. It starts with this kind of, again, something that's almost beyond language, and then we kind of need to pull it into language, and as we do so, we come against we hit sort of almost the bars, if you like, of symbolic language, right? Because symbolic language is so slippery, and the signifier can't really be pinned down, and yet, so that's where you go from, like, if you like, heaven to earth, right? Because that's you move towards that trigram earth,
Mm.
and you're wrestling with it on earth, and it's only really ever it's only ever complete in a way when it's sort of up there, or as to say, in this place in the head, the sort of the impulse place. I mean, what's it like for you, Mark, when you do you experience something similar? Do you experience that? What's that slippage like, if you from when you move from heaven to earth, as it were, from the idea, the conception, to the capture?
Pure torture. I
Is
mean,
it?
most of the time,
Is it
yes.
actually? But is it really in this sort of Pessoan way? Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I feel like, um, Malcolm Lowry, who had his wife strap him down to the chair and force him to write. I have to basically do that to myself.
Really?
Yeah, it's not joyful. Now the joy comes when I complete something, right? Like when I finally get it down, I force myself to sit down. I know what I'm going to do. I know what I'm going to do. I have the conception. I know where I'm going. But the most difficult part for me is dealing with the procrastination. Yeah, I don't really feel like doing that today. I'll do it tomorrow. I keep putting it off, keep putting it off. Then I realize, okay, my self imposed deadline is today. So I force myself to sit down. I strap myself into the chair since I don't have someone else to do that for me. And then I sit down. I do it however long it takes. It's miserable. There's so much self-doubt, so much anguish. But then you get to a point where, okay, you read back over it. Okay, I did it. It's good enough. It's actually pretty great. I'm pleased with this. I'm going to go to sleep. And then you wake up the next day and you start editing and you're like, oh no, what have I done? And then the whole process starts again. And then you go through the editing and it's like, okay, yeah, finally, I think this is good enough to let my editor see, or, it's good enough to share. But it's not, for me, most of the time, it's not a joyful process. But when I actually finish, when it comes time to publish, when you get the book, that's a pretty exciting feeling, or
Yeah.
release a new music video or whatever. But then there's usually disappointment in the reaction. It's like, oh, okay, so 150 people listened. That's great.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I there have been times where it's been like that for me, but I have to say, kind of in the last few years, it has become more joyful. And part of that is because I now have a writing assistant. Now, I don't get this writing assistant to actually create full text for me, but I'm talking here, of course, about my bromance with GPT-4. But I have found GPT-4 as a large language model to be so useful for dealing with the kinds of stuff that we struggle with as writers, or the kinds of stuff that I used to struggle with as writers. There's sort of I'm writing something and, what's the word I need, right? Whereas now I'll just leave a space. I'll just be like, blah, 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 blah. I'll leave a space, and then I'll say to GPT, okay, fill that space. And even if it doesn't fill it with exactly the right word, or the word that is perfect, it kind of, it gets me through. Or I don't know, I use it a lot. Like, for example, when I'm in the conceptualizing headspace, right, and I'm just going for a walk, I'll take up my phone, I'll hit that sort of voice note mode and just sort of speak out a whole bunch of stuff, and then say to GPT, transcribe it and put it into a slightly more writerly tone, if you like, make it more written, what I've just said to you. And it's really, really good at doing that. Now, of course, I don't just take that. I then fiddle around with it. But it really, really is, this is my experience, and it's made writing more pleasurable for me. It really is like having, I don't know, a sort of around the clock personal assistant, editor, whatever. That's helped me a lot. And have you ever fiddled around with that, or had the desire to play with that?
No. In fact, I I don't know, for the kind of writing I do, I would feel like that was cheating.
Yeah.
Even, sometimes even like typing feels like cheating, especially if
Uh-huh.
I'm
Uh-huh.
doing like something lyrical, like a song or a short poem or prose poem or whatever. I want pen and notebook, and of course I have other ways of cheating, like dictionaries and thesauruses and so on. But
But
I
don't you think
often
writers are always in some way cheating? I mean, wasn't
absolutely,
Even though
absolutely,
Pessoa was writing with a pen, or right? I mean, I think the fact that he was somewhat inebriated most of the time, that's a form of cheating, right? That I think
absolutely,
a lot of this stuff came from a certain kind of altered consciousness, altered by you know fags, coffee, and vast quantities of red wine. So
absolutely.
those, his work, as it were, it's like, it's as much coffee, cigarettes, and wine, this book, as it is whatever his the neurochemicals in his mind were able to furnish.
Absolutely, and I've certainly used any number of substances for the purposes of creation. It's just, I don't know. I mean, maybe eventually I'll make my peace with that, but thus far
Yeah.
I haven't. I think I'm consciously trying to resist that, but I don't know. Maybe eventually I'll give in. It's just that um, I don't know. One of the reasons I do it is like the challenge. I set myself a particular challenge, and I have certain guidelines or rules which maybe I can't even explain. It's so idiosyncratic. But eventually maybe I'll experiment with these other
I think the main
methods.
point here is to enjoy creating something, So it's like with my summer
Yeah, but very
project, I'm
different
stealing
forms of
huge parts
enjoyment,
of
because
songs.
listening to Mark talking, my enjoyment is, I would say, again, a very Enneagram 4 kind of enjoyment. It's the enjoyment of being able to finally and authentically say what I fucking want to say, and to say it in the way that I fucking want to say it, right? And that's really all it's about for me. That's the pleasure. It's not about I mean, those other things are important too, but that's fundamentally what it's about. Whereas the way you're talking about it, I do hear more of, like, I would say, again, an Enneagram kind of 8 types process, which again, it's this idea, yes, the idea of challenge, the idea of, yes, I'm gonna push that freaking boulder up the hill.
Mm,
Again, it's very Sisyphean,
Mark likes that
right?
Sisyphean image too, so it seems fairly apt for you to
Yeah.
come
No,
back
no,
to
it's one
that.
of my, again, that's one of my desert island books, that Myth of Sisyphus. Have you guys done the Myth of Sisyphus?
no,
The Camus, right? Hmm.
But
we'll
Camus
put
came up
that
in
on the
my
list though.
thoughts
Great
today
text,
as
yeah.
well. Just reading about the barber shop, which I think comes up. Did we already get past the barber shop?
No, not yet.
Yeah, that comes
We
later
need to
anyway.
we
It's a
need to
very
move.
Merceau
Yeah, let's move
moment.
on.
We've got about 20 minutes, but yeah, I mean, um, I don't know what else I want to say about the torture of writing, but I don't want to mislead anyone to think that there's no joy. It's just the process. I mean, I totally agree about yes, I'm going to say what I want to say the way I want to say it. Yes, but often the process for me is difficult and challenging.
Mm, mm.
Maybe I'm just a masochist. I don't know. I'm not an old grandma, doing the crocheting. Maybe I should be more like that. All right, so here we have fragment 227. I picked this one because I think it's interesting how he um, has this hierarchy of writing. He says, I'm convinced that in a perfect civilized world, there would be no other art but prose. So he, somewhat, I don't know, somewhat unusually for literary folk,
And yet, this is a
he,
man. Let's just remind ourselves, because this is his paean. I never know how to pronounce that word. He's paean to prose, and yet this is a man who wrote, just reams and reams of poetry as well.
right. Yeah, so there's always a, I don't know, ironic or paradoxical element to everything he says. But
Yeah, yeah.
this is something I saw at the Pessoa Museum.
Uh huh.
They had this book which is actually in Spanish. It says "Todo arte es una forma de literatura," and this is supposedly what Pessoa said originally in Portuguese, of course. But the translation is "All art is a form of literature." This is a notion that has influenced me greatly ever since I first, heard about it. Like
Hmm.
everything, music, painting, film, it's all actually a kind of writing. Any thoughts about that?
Can you explain it further, like how that is the case?
I mean, I think that's particularly interesting. Yeah, because how does that work for music, right? I mean,
Songwriting is literature.
songwriting certainly.
That's one of my uh, hashtags that never caught on. Songwriting is literature.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
But yeah, I mean that's how I approach it, right? Like
But that's
that's
still
more
very rooted
important
in
than
text. I mean, that's like not that hard of a jump
okay,
because it's basically a
sure.
poem, right? So, but what about some things that are that are
Okay, well
more
then
challenging to?
think of
Piece of
paint.
abstract
Think
art,
of
like
paint.
let's
Think
take a
of
Rothko
painting.
painting. A Rothko painting, yeah.
There
How
you
is that
go.
like literature? Because that just feels more like a suffused feeling in color,
Because
right?
it's a kind of writing. If you think back to the origin of writing, like cave paintings, people are like scratching something on a surface of some
Yeah,
sort. Um,
yeah,
Language, like think of Egyptian hieroglyphics, right? These are images, or Chinese ideograms, right? Like they're images, but no one can deny that they're writing. So I don't know. It's just you don't have to take it too seriously, but
Sure.
this particular statement just has always fascinated me, and I think it's had a profound influence on me. As Tomek knows, I do some. Oh, there was a period when I did like a lot of collages when I was working at a job which didn't really enable me to do the kind of writing I wanted to do. So that was my writing. Instead
mm,
of like
mm,
writing a short story or a travelogue or poetry or a novel or something, in the evenings I would work on my collages, and that was my writing. And so this this quote was always present in my mind. All art is a
I
form
guess
of
I'm just
literature. So
asking for
this is
like, why make literature like paramount? Like, why does that go to the top of the hierarchy? Why
well
don't you say
because
todo arte es una forma de poetry or de
right, the
music? You know, you
poesía
could make the
or
same kind of like twists
de
And
for.
maybe
film.
we're maybe
Sure.
we're back there with the William Stafford right line about the thread, because I think if it was all art is a form of a kind of consciously followed thread, right? A sort of a symbolic thread. Because again, the reason why that poem is such a touchstone for me is that like you, I've done in my kind of creative output lots and lots of different things. I've done web comics, I've done, novels and podcasts and music, writing songs, etc., etc. And in a way, where I've got to now is just sort of seeing it as a thread. So, my 10-minute YouTube video that I'm working on at the moment about, Pavement's Raft. It's just the next 10 minutes of my thread, but I could be doing anything. I could be doing a watercolor. I could be writing a song. I could, but it all feels like it's part of the same.
I hear that 100%. I'm just asking again, like, why the supremacy of literature is the art form that this quote has chosen.
Because he's a writer, like if he were a filmmaker, he would say todo arte es una forma de film.
Exactly.
It's probably just that.
So that's why it appeals to me, because that's how I define myself, right? Like everything I do is writing. Like even if I'm making music, that's a form of writing. I want it. That's why that hashtag was important to me. Songwriting is literature. I want to make it, I want it to have the same importance. I want it to
impact.
I want it to get the same level of respect, so.
Well, Bob Dylan helped you out with that, getting the Nobel Prize and everything.
Well, Dylan and, Morrissey, and so it's just a personal preference.
I guess it's giving it also a kind of a sort of a sacred quality to it, right? Because nowadays, I guess in my sort of cynicism, I don't refer to myself as a writer anymore, because I also used to find that a little bit poncy, particularly because I don't necessarily have lots to show for it, but to show as in, physical artifacts. So nowadays I just call
it's
myself
all in the chest.
Nowadays I call myself a content creator, essentially, right? But of course, there's nothing sacred about content creation. Whereas I think if you're talking about painting and music and literature, you're bringing the sacred into that realm.
Well, and there's something about
very true.
Yes, and it's something related to the people behind the creation of Orfeu, that obscure literary magazine, or might I add, co-reality, right? It's just a little niche, avant-garde, underground maybe is the best description. It's kind of like, this is not for everyone, okay? So if you want a content creator, then go to YouTube. I, on the other hand, am a writer producing literature in one form or another. Everything I do is literature. And I also like how it is kind of a challenge to the more mainstream, popular, acceptable authors, right? Like, I don't know, take your average New York Times best-selling author, right? Like, that's assumed to be literature. Well, no, actually, when I write a song and record it and release it on YouTube, that's literature too. Okay, New York Times. So
yeah, and I think what you're talking to here is also this idea of community, which is very important. I mean, I want to read you this little quote from this Todd McGowan, because I think it's a nice frame. He talks in here about how we're all alienated subjects, and yet in the meeting of one alienated subject with another alienated subject through literature, through art, there is a form of kind of community. But there's this particular quote that I like, where he says, alienation. This is right at the beginning of the book. He says, alienation has often been got a bad rap, but actually, alienation is the basis for our capacity for transcending whatever our given situation might be. And I think you could say that the same thing about literature and art, right? It's inherently transcendent by separating ourselves, by saying, okay, well, I'm not the New York Times bestseller. I'm now this, and I identify with these people. These are my community,
Yeah.
dead or alive. Right? We can then transcend situations that can feel like they sort of trap us or nullify us or deaden us, as a lot of popular culture is wont to do.
Hmm. Yes, indeed. All right, moving on to fragment 231. We've touched upon this theme already, but I think this particular fragment expressed it well. One of the soul's great tragedies is to execute a work and then realize once it's finished that it's not any good. Ode to failure.
I think we've covered that.
Yeah.
We could
Yeah.
probably go to the next fragment.
Yep.
I
Well,
feel like we've sort of said what we needed to say about that one.
absolutely. And thankfully so, because we've only got about 10 minutes. But again, that's another quality of the book of Disquiet. There's a lot of repetition. There's a lot that is repeated over and over again. All right, here we go to fragment 396. This is related to the Pessoan concept of the heteronym, this idea that, an individual has many different names, which is literally what heteronym would mean, different name. So Fernando Pessoa is also Alvaro de Campos, Bernardo Soares, and on and on. He says, each of us is several, is many, is a profusion of selves. In the vast colony of our being, there are many species of people who think and feel in different ways. But look at this.
Wait, can I just
442.
I really like something else in segment 396, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
I really preferred not preferred, but the paragraph that spoke to me was the previous paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
I really liked this line: whether we like it or not, we're servants of the hour and its colors and shapes. We're subjects of the sky and earth. Yeah, and I like that kind of communal sense that, first of all, we're all living in the same moment, right? We're all affected by the same weather, and that's something that ties us together and kind of goes beyond that sense of alienation. It can be very comforting. Or it's interesting to try to sense this particular historical moment that we're living in, like now, 2024, like what's the overall vibe, right? I like kind of thinking about that, and yeah.
You're referring there, I think, to the macro aspect of this, but I guess there's also the sort of micro aspect, because that was how I read it, right? That we like to hold the narrative of ourselves as being somewhat stable, and I'm the self and who does these things and who likes these things, and yet we are so determined and tangential in the sense, what came to mind when you read it, Tom, was me sending you that message yesterday saying, I'm not doing any more than 50 minutes on this freaking book because I am fucking depressed and I cannot sit here and talk for more than about 50 minutes. Well, that was me yesterday. Now here I am
and
today.
I get that.
I've done some exercise. I had my cold plunge. I've happily sat and done 2 hours, thankfully, and thank you, on Pessoa. And what was that about, right? Completely different person.
Sure. Yeah, and sensing that, I think it's very healthy. That's the point. Is like the transience. Like, that's a great psychological advantage for anyone, right? Just to really be able to internalize that whole "this too shall pass," But
Yeah.
but yeah, I just like the idea that we're not in control. So
Well, let's juxtapose the notion of the heteronyms with this excerpt from fragment 442. And
Yeah.
someone else can read it. I've been reading too much, so let's hear someone
go ahead,
else's
Steve.
rendering.
Even while saying that I'm always different, I feel that I've always said the same thing, that I resemble myself more than I'd like to admit. That when the books are balanced, I've had neither the joy of winning nor the emotion of losing.
So this is what you said earlier, Steve, that, all of these heteronyms,
Yeah.
they're
It's
really
always him.
transparently Pessoa. It's all, he gives them different
Always him.
names and they have different traits, but not really. They're always like anonymous, lonely, melancholic
Yeah.
guys who write,
He can't escape himself, essentially, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, oh, well, let me get away from this self by creating this other heteronym, and then he starts writing as the other heteronym, and then the heteronym becomes him again. It's like that Being John Malkovich film. It's just being Fernando Pessoa. It's like he's just always him, frustratingly so.
Well, I'd love it if you guys could clarify, because Mark, you keep reiterating how it's written through Bernardo Suarez, and then I'm hearing about all these different heteronyms. How clear is it when a new heteronym is introduced and so on? Yeah, if you could, why are you saying that this is all Bernardo Suarez if there are all these other characters?
I mean, I want to read again a little quote from Todd McGowan, because I do think this sheds a bit of light on this, because he's talking about this kind of internal distance. You could say the heteronym is creating an internal distance between one idea of the self and another idea. And McGowan says, without this internal distance, one could not emerge as a subject with the ability to relate to itself. An initial split generates and defines subjectivity. And I think Pessoa is all about subjectivity, right? He's not interested in the objective stance. Our separation from ourselves enables us to be who we are by emphasizing that we are inextricable from what is foreign within us. The foreignness within is essential to who we are. It gives us our singularity. I don't know, for some reason that connects to all of this, right? That it's about this continuing game he's playing within himself of objectivity, subjectivity, separation, alienation. I don't know. I can't say any more than that, but maybe you could riff a little bit of that.
I can't. Just like when I attended some kind of self-help workshop when I was like 19 or 20, and the person insisted that we write about our lives like in the third person,
Yeah,
as a way of developing empathy for ourselves. So I think that it's a really useful tool in that sense to create that distance to then create a sympathy.
it is. Yeah, and I'm noticing this with my idiot channel, because when I am talking about stuff that is very personal, it really helps me to refer to this other as the idiot. Right.
Sure.
Because it's like, well, it's not me. It's this guy.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
and you use it as a kind of leveler as well.
Yeah.
But Mark, you wanted to say about
there are many.
Yeah.
Many things. First of all, what is the name of this author? Pessoa.
Yeah.
Do you know what it means?
Person.
I looked it up once, but I forgot.
Person. Okay. Persona. What is a persona? In Latin, it is a mask. And so this reminds me of a collection of plays by Pirandello called Naked Masks. So think about that concept, right? Like the author, the artist, since we're talking about literature, okay, so let's assume it's the author. Think of an author like Philip Roth, right? Like whatever character, Nathan Zuckerman or any of the other characters, it's always Philip Roth,
Yeah, that's another great example. Yeah.
So So these are naked masks. Yes, they have different names. Yes, they appear to have different features, but they're transparent. You can see through them, you know? You can see that it's really Pessoa. So that's how I would,
Yeah.
balance these two fragments. On the one hand, yes, there are all these heteronyms, they're all different, but at the same time, they're
I
always the
feel you,
same.
and I'm just asking you to clarify because in these excerpts that you shared with me, I didn't, none of these other heteronyms were really introduced. So I was just
No, no,
wondering.
no. Oh,
I
not
get
in
your.
the, but not in this book. Not in the book of Disquiet. It's understood that the author of the book of Disquiet is Bernardo Soares. Okay,
So
and the
where are these other
preface
heteronyms?
in
How do I
in
come
in
across them?
in other fragments. Like there are some. I guess like a lot of them were published in Orfeu, and a lot of them were found in that trunk. Like the trunk does not. I don't think it consisted only of fragments that
No,
wound up in
Okay.
the Book of Disquiet. There
I
were
didn't.
there were like Alvaro de Campos fragments, which were
Okay,
translated
now I get it. I didn't know
and
that.
published
Okay.
later. Yeah,
I'm
I
looking.
think that's yeah.
I'm looking for the Zenith collection of the poetry because I have that as well. That's a Penguin book. I think you see it much more when you look through the poems, because I think he did various poetic projects, and maybe Message was one of those, right? Um, various poetic projects that were written more explicitly from a certain heteronym, and I think that was perhaps I think that it's easier to see that being followed through, I guess,
Hmm.
if you look at some of the poetry rather than the prose. Whereas because the prose, I think particularly a prose voice. I mean, Roth is such a good example, right? It's always that voice. Once you've developed a certain voice, particularly in prose, um, that's kind of your voice. And
Mm-hmm.
yes, there are a few writers who can do different voices and are very adept at that, almost ventriloquists in a way. But a lot of writers, think of even someone like George Eliot. George Eliot is always kind of George Eliot in terms of how she writes.
Mm. One of the other heteronyms is Ricardo Reis. Ricardo Reis. Um, and interestingly, the Portuguese writer Saramago, Jose Saramago, he wrote a novel about this heteronym, the year of the death of Ricardo Reis. So, uh, 20th century, 21st century Portuguese writer, Nobel Prize winner Saramago, he takes Pessoa's heteronym and writes an entire
Mm.
novel about his fictitious life, which is interesting.
Have you read that? I think I started it, but I didn't really make much headway with it.
I did read it. I did finish it, and I enjoyed it. Saramago's not my favorite author, but I have enjoyed the books I've read, and he's got one called The Double also, which deals with these Pessoan identity issues.
Yeah, it feels very, very postmodern. It feels very, very much of of the age in a way, and all the doubling and kind of identity games that we play online again feels very, very Pessoan, right? I mean,
Mm,
we're all, all of our different avatars and the way that we brand ourselves this way or that way, depending on whatever project we're on or whatever platform we're on. It's all a piece of this.
mm, absolutely. All right. Fragment 464.
Yes, this is the one about the dreamer. Everything's everything valid that happens in our life is but dream. Yeah.
Anyone want to read this? Tomek,
Pardon? Sure. Okay.
you want to read it?
Yeah, sure. Whoever has read the pages of this book will by now surely have concluded that I'm a dreamer, and he will have concluded wrongly. I lack the money to be a dreamer.
Another Pessoan paradox, or at least, I don't know, a kind of misdirection.
Yeah, total misdirection, because actually you don't need that much money to be a dreamer, right? As so many penniless or close to penniless writers have proven, particularly for writing. I mean, maybe I lack the money to be a filmmaker, but to be a dreamer and a writer, wow! All you just need is a big pen and a few sheets of A4 that you've stolen from the photocopier at work.
Yes.
I get that, but I'm gonna say this is another instance for me of like the both and texting philosophy. I mean, just to read the next line, which I think is also very well written. Great melancholies and sorrows full of tedium can exist only in an atmosphere of comfort and solemn luxury. I have a close friend, Carlos, who's a writer, and money is definitely at the forefront of a lot of his anxiety. And I think particularly if you're a parent, you suddenly have like this greater weight of responsibility, and money, yeah, it can it can definitely affect the tone, I would say, of your existence if you're struggling, right? It's a very Dostoevskian motif as well. I mean, Raskolnikov couldn't really be a dreamer, because of his circumstances. Well, he dreamed in a different way. So, but anyway,
Well,
I
but
don't know.
later he says, but there is also the universe of the Rua dos Douradores. Here, God also grants that the enigma of life knows no bounds. My
Sure.
dreams may be poor, like the landscape of carts and crates from among whose wheels and boards I conceive them, but they're what I have and am able to have.
Sure, and I like the way he romanticizes his surroundings. I think it's very beautiful, and it's inspiring. To see the again, it's very like
Yeah,
egalitarian view. And go on, Steve.
yeah, no. And I think for all his frustration, in a way, right, Pessoa does exemplify in some kind of not so corny way, kind of like the Serenity Prayer, grant me the serenity, accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things. Well, he didn't really change that much, but he certainly, yeah, there is a kind of a serenity there, even though he rants against what he doesn't have, and he has all of the envy and all of the resentment, I think, of that personality style. There is a lot of acceptance and a lot of, and that's because I think it's because he knows what he's about, and he knows what his thread is, right?
But also, it depends on the day for him, right? Just like you said about yourself earlier. I mean, you read one passage,
Yeah,
and it's like a very
sure.
stalwart defense of stoicism, and kind of he doesn't care, and then the next one he's complaining and suffering.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah.
very much like a diary in that sense, and that's okay. That's very human, obviously.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
Okay, the final fragment that we'll look at today is the last one in Zenith's edition, 481. This is the barbershop fragment, for lack of a better name. Anyone want to read this?
Nostalgia. I even feel it for people and things that were nothing to me, because time's fleeing is for me an anguish, and life's mystery is a torture.
And on that happy note,
On that happy note, that's all, folks.
But again, he contradicts that idea like earlier on, where he says that he dismisses pessimism and says, "Oh, people that look at the tragedy of life, they're just being overdramatic. They're exaggerating."
Hmm.
So it's like this is a mood, and that's fine.
It's a mood, but it's also him acknowledging, right, that if you if you was caught in the trap of the mind, because that's what the mind does, it looks back and feels nostalgic, or it looks forward and feels fearful or is yearning for something, then you're scuppered. But a lot of the book is not about that. A lot of the book is him being kind of almost in a sort of more Eckhart Tollian way, fully immersed in his thoughts, in his dreams, in
the senses.
the senses and all of that, and that's where also all the richness emerges, because if it was really just 500 pages of this, no one would ever read it.
Well, also from this fragment, we've got the concluding lines which say, "Tomorrow I too will vanish from the Rua de Prata, the Rua dos Douradores, the Rua dos Franqueiros." He's talking about the barber that also died. "Tomorrow I too, I this soul that feels and thinks, this universe I am for myself. Yes, tomorrow I too will be the one who no longer walks these streets, whom others will vaguely evoke with a 'what's become of him?' And everything I've done, everything I've felt, and everything I've lived will amount merely to one less passerby on the everyday streets of some city or other."
Yeah, I find those lines incredibly touching. You know, they're a real memento mori, and I guess also written 45 years before Ernest Becker's what's it called? What's his famous book, The Fear of Death or something? Ernest Becker's death book, which essentially, you know, giving a reason for why we write and have children and, I don't know, make buildings and stuff like that, right? Because we all carry within us that knowledge that unless we leave something of ourselves behind, it's like we were never here.
The Denial of Death. That's the book.
Denial, that's it, right? Yes.
I
But
have it on my
that's a very
shelf somewhere,
egocentric
but I
view,
had
though,
to
right?
look it up.
I would say it's
Well,
very
he would
because
say
we're
it's
all
an
related,
ego.
and everything's the past made us. We're the there is no individual really, right? I mean, there's
Well, yeah, you're right. You're talking from an egoless and even kind of awakened viewpoint. But he would say, rather than egocentric, he would just say that is the core of human consciousness,
experience.
human experience, the human ego, absolutely. That sort of says, oh, I am separate. I am somewhat separate from others, but this separation, I'm keenly aware of it now. But as soon as I die, that's it. It's all gone.
Well, but he recommends an immortality project, right? Like you have to give yourself to something greater than you, even though there may be an egoic motivation. I want to live on. I mean, you're not doing it merely for self promotion, right? Like your immortality project is not just endless pimping of the self or endless self promotion.
Yeah. I mean, immortality project sounds very grand, but I do think it's a very meaningful part of our human experience that it's just the idea of it, right? Because I don't think humanity is going to probably last, maybe not even for more than a couple of centuries going forwards. I can't see it happening. So in the back of my mind, when I'm thinking, or even you're thinking, well, I'm putting these books out and then I'm going to die, and maybe someone in the future will pick it up and read them, and I don't know where we are currently in our human evolution. I suspect that's not going to occur. I suspect that in a 500 years' time, it's just going to be rubble and dust.
Well, you're more optimistic than I am. I would give it 5 years, but but
Okay, I
okay.
was trying. Yeah, I was. Yeah. But equally, but that doesn't. You're right. That doesn't stop that immortality project being meaningful now, and it is meaningful,
Hmm.
right? And it is. It brings us back to our desks or our editing stations, because what else are we going to do? Just stare out the window and scratch our asses? Well, we do enough of that already, so
Hmm.
got to do something, right?
You gotta just really be
By
present when you're scratching your ass,
What's that?
You gotta just be really present when you're scratching your ass, so that it becomes the
Well,
scratching of the
yeah.
ass, elevates to the level of writing. You just have to,
Yeah.
because everything is
Absolutely.
literature.
Everything is literature, including the movement
I remember
of
I
the
once
fingernails across one's buttocks.
I was really prolific in my time in Korea with just whatever it was, whether it was writing or collaging. And my girlfriend at the time, she didn't have that same vibe at all. This is actually before Sujung, Mark, but anyway, it was this lady named Sunny. But when I kind of pushed her, I was like, "Don't you want to make something?" And she said, "My life is art," and I found it kind of superficial in the moment, but in hindsight, like, good for her, like, she didn't have that same. And I don't know if insecurity is the right word, but the same kind of just fire that I needed to constantly produce. It's like it was just a bit more balanced, and yeah, so I think that's a good place to be as well.
It is balanced because it does, to create art does take it does impose or require sacrifices, and we give of those willingly, but we are also aware, I'm aware that yesterday I could have gone on a hike because the weather was nice, but I chose to sit at home and complete a YouTube video because I really, really wanted to, and I was impatient and I couldn't wait. And that requires a sacrifice, whereas someone who's not making the stuff will do things that maybe are more in balance with their lifestyle and with other people. We also know that artists are, of course, notoriously selfish, right? You don't really want to be kind of married or a partner to someone, because their work will demand that time away.
I think Lord Byron provides some insight worth quoting here. This is from Don Juan. But why then publish? There are no rewards of fame or profit when the world grows weary. I ask in turn, why do you play at cards? Why drink? Why read? To make some hour less dreary. It occupies me to turn back regards on what I've seen or pondered, sad or cheery. And what I write, I cast upon the stream to swim or sink. I've had at least my dream.
Nice.
Yeah, that's really good.
Good job, Lord Byron.
Well, I feel like we've tied it all together. It's all been nicely tied, but with the Byronic bow.
Byronic boner.
The Byronic boner, yeah.
It does seem like a good place to end, so let's skip over this bit about the Disquiet anthology. There are some more fragments at the end, but I picked one called The Art of Effective Dreaming because at the moment dreams are a kind of obsession of mine, but we'll save that for another time. I just want to once again.
Have you ever explored or have you ever been able to lucid dream? Is that something you've explored much, Mark?
I have tried it. You're probably familiar with the Carlos Castaneda book, The Art of Dreaming. I've tried to do some of that. Not very successfully, but yes, I'm interested in it.
One of our first podcasts was on Waking Life, the film
Waking
by
Life,
Richard
yeah.
Linklater.
Oh, I love that film.
Right.
Yeah.
And I do keep a dream journal as well. And I'm amazed when I go back and look at it. I'm amazed at all the things, that I'd forgotten, right? Like the idea is as soon as you wake up, write down whatever you can remember. And there are
Mm.
many things that I've been able to salvage, like using that method. So I recommend a dream journal for anyone who is doing creative work, because there are a lot of things that you will simply forget if you don't write them down or transcribe them. I guess you could do an audio dream journal, but yeah, a lot of songs and melodies have come to me in dreams, and I wake up and hum them into the phone or whatever. But lucid dreaming is a tricky thing. Have you
Mm.
had
No,
success
I
with
mean I've
that?
read
Or?
a lot about it, and I've tried it, but you need to really work at it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it requires more discipline than I have, I'm afraid. Anyway, once again, get your translation of
I'm going to read that. I'm looking
Message
forward to
Audiobook by
seeing what
Guy
you.
on
Bethel.
Amazon.
You already know what it is.
Audio
Where's the
book
audio?
by
Where's the audiobook on? Is that on Audible?
Audible. Yes, absolutely. Read by
Amazing.
Guy Bethel, father of my co-host Tomek. And if you're in
Incredible.
Lisbon, go to Cafe a Brasileira and get the deluxe edition of my translation, for which I receive no royalties or
Yeah.
loyalties. All right, and what's our next text?
All
Our
right.
next text is the seminal album by Outkast, Stankonia. I think hopefully we'll find some rich commentary on America, and I feel like with the election coming up, I don't know, songs like Bombs Over Baghdad, I feel like there's going to be some good stuff there for us to digest. And it bangs.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. Once again, please subscribe to us on Substack. I'm at Mark Will Write, WRITE.substack.com. My co-host is at tomacb.substack.com. Eventually, this video will be on my YouTube channel. That's at Mark Will Write, WRITE. This has been Season 3, Episode 17 of Texting. Our text was Fernando Pessoa's The Book of Disquiet. We read excerpts from the Richard Zenith translation, which we recommend. Thanks again to our guest, Steve, host of
Thank you
the
guys.
Idiots
It's been great.
Ching YouTube channel. Anything you want to promote or?
Well, no, I mean, I am launched onto. I feel like anything I say now, we know how YouTube works, right? No one's going to hear it anyway. But it's like, but
The illusion is what it's all about.
yeah, the illusion was all about. Yeah, for that one person is listening. Yeah, I'm sort of doing this series of 101 love songs for recovering romantics, which feels like a very Pessoan project. So yeah, looking forward to doing more of those. That's my current thread that I'm
Those
following.
are going to be original pieces, or are you reading pieces by other poets?
No. So those are just basically me. Yeah, just building a little 12-minute rant around a particular song.
Okay.
Yeah,
Some of the
writing a project. I'm also doing a writing project on the trigrams at the moment because I'm so obsessed with them. So I'm kind of writing a monograph on each of the trigrams called 64, and this will also be a YouTube channel, 64 utterances on. So at the moment I'm writing 64 utterances on heaven. Again, it's quite Pessoan in a way, like just collecting together all of these fragments and then organizing them as these 64 utterances. And the idea is that I'm going to do 64 utterances on heaven and 64 utterances on the other 8.
Sounds like a Mark Will project. You guys have a lot in common with your idiosyncratic
Absolutely.
obsessions.
Yeah, we need to have you back on to discuss both the Enneagram in greater detail and the I Ching and a lot of other
I
things.
think it would be fun because I think the Enneagram. I'm not sure if that's a deviant text, but I do think the I Ching is a very interesting text,
Hmm.
right? Just to think about it as a kind of a text, particularly the core of it, which is not all the commentary and all of that stuff, right? Just the core, which is these sort of the zhou yi, where it all sort of starts with these kind of various pronouncements, these judgments with the images. Very, very strange, interesting, and also magical because it works. Every question I ask, I get an answer.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's kind of like a magical text, truly magical. Yeah.
Absolutely. I agree.
So it'd be fun to do that maybe one day.
We
Yeah.
should. We should. All right. Well, I guess
Thank
that
you, guys.
wraps things up here. Thanks again, everybody.
Thanks,
Thanks to
Steve.
our guest.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks to my co host.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next time.